Welcome to this Asia Global podcast, brought to you by the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. I'm your host, Alejandro Reyes, the Institute's Director of Knowledge Dissemination. In our programs here in Hong Kong and online, and in the content that we produce, we focus on presenting Asian perspectives on global issues. Our focus in this episode is Russia. Russia is a Pacific power pursuing its own pivot to Asia. Moscow has been fostering relationships in the region, particularly a growing alignment with Beijing. It has also expressed some skepticism of the emerging free and open Indo-Pacific concept promoted by the United States. Indeed, the emergence of the Indo-Pacific construct has arguably been the most important development in international relations in Asia in recent years. Driven by and large by Japan, the US, and to a lesser extent, Australia, the debate over the concept and what it means has inspired some countries to rally to it. India is perhaps the most prominent player in the region to do so. Countries in Europe, such as Germany, France, and the Netherlands, have set out their own Indo-Pacific approaches, and indeed, the EU recently launched its own Indo-Pacific strategy. That was, in fact, on the same day that the US, the UK, and Australia launched a new alliance focused on creating a nuclear-powered submarine program for Australia. The so-called AUKUS, Asia, United Kingdom, United States, the AUKUS alliance, has roused much debate in recent days about the security dynamics in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, whichever term you wish to use. So less is known about the Russian Federation's attitude to this framework shift. About 2/3 of Russia's territory is situated in Asia, which Moscow considers a region vital for the country's security and economic development. The government's plan to diversify its foreign policy, security, economic and energy ties, and expand cooperation with Asian states is known as the turn to the East or pivot to Asia. To help us understand the Russian perspective and Russia's own initiatives in the region, we're joined by Anna Kireeva, Associate Professor in the Department of Asian and African Studies and Research Fellow in the Center for Comprehensive Chinese Studies and Regional Projects at Moscow State Institute of International Relations. I'm going to try this. Moskovsky Государственный институт международных отношений, MGIMO. Anna Andreevna, здравствуйте. Мне очень приятно представить вас. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much. Hi to everyone, and your Russian is perfect.
Я учил в университете. I studied in university. So welcome, Anna. In your article on Asia Global Online, you write that Russia's long-standing approach has been centered on the promotion of inclusive, open, transparent, and equitable collective security and cooperation architecture in the Asia-Pacific, which in Moscow's eyes should cater for the security of all regional states, but not guarantee the security of one state at the expense of others, as the alliances, the existing alliances in the region do. Now, the deterioration of Russia's relations with the West, particularly the United States in the aftermath of the crisis over Crimea and Ukraine, translated into more attempts to facilitate engagement with Asia, to safeguard against the damage to the Russian economy by falling oil prices and economic sanctions, as well as structural economic issues. So tell us a bit about this Turn East initiative. How has it been proceeding, and what are the key pillars of this Turn East initiative?
Thank you so much. This probably should be seen as a very long-term strategic course rather than something recent. We'll look at actually who initiated this kind of attitude that Russia needs to have more diversified foreign policy, more diversified economic contacts. We can probably even look back to Evgeny Primakov and late 1990s when practical policy demonstrated a lot of imbalances on Russia's too much focus on cooperation with the West in 1990s. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and after the Russian Federation was formed. So Primakov launched his policy of trying to focus more on cooperating with China and India, and also kind of Asia or the East in general, including broader Asia and the Middle East. And probably from early this century, we can see it as a kind of strategic long-term course to have relations with Asia, at least more or less as much developed as possible with this particular region. And of course, there has been very clear-cut logic because Asia has been the center of economic growth. And as you have already mentioned, a huge amount of Russia's territory, a huge part of Russia's territory is geographically situated in Asia. However, Russia's ties with Asia, if we compare it with the ties with Europe and the West, Russia's ties with Asia, of course, have been much, much less. So this is kind of a course to try to bridge this gap, I should say. To diversify its policies. So we also could probably go back to 2012 when Russia hosted its APEC summit in Vladivostok, which was also in the Far East of Russia, which was also seen as a kind of an attempt to demonstrate that Russia wants the Far East to become the gateway to the Asia-Pacific and wants to more seriously engage with the region. So kind of a long-term development. And if we look at this in the long term, we will see that the share of Russia's trade investment with Asia has grown in the last 2 and 3 decades, if we compare it to the share of Russia's trade and investment with Europe and with the West. So in these kind of long-term, we can clearly see this as one of Russia's foreign policy and economic strategies. Also now, as for energy, there is really a need to diversify energy markets. And it's quite logical that Russia wants to have more engagement with China, the biggest energy consumer, and also with other states such as Japan, South Korea, ASEAN states. And there are also different projects going on and discussions how to supply more energy to India, which is also one of the biggest net importers and is probably going to become more prominent in this role. So again, this is kind of logical not to put all your eggs in one basket, but just to try to diversify your baskets and put your different eggs into different baskets. And basically we can see that there has been all these years a lot of political political contacts, a lot of diplomatic efforts put into this. Also a lot of kind of that has been probably more focused now, especially since 2014, specifically on developing cooperation with Asia, if we compare it to what predated the Ukrainian crisis. Okay. However, even given that, we could probably say that there is still a lot of potential. There is still actually, it's kind of a work in progress. We cannot say that Russia has really done or has really achieved a huge, enormous success. There has been some success, kind of slowly but steadily, and we can probably say that there is still a lot of potential that remains untapped, unrealized. And of course, sanctions, especially US secondary sanctions, they have actually played a negative role on Russia's contacts with Asia recently and have somehow hindered these contacts, especially in the economic realm, in the economic domain.
Thank you. If I could just take up from what you said. So in fact, you can go back quite a bit and see the genesis of a turn east policy. Indeed, if you're sitting in this region in some, and you've been following developments, one could say, oh, we've seen this movie before. I mean, if you think about even back to Gorbachev or what have you, and of course, we always remember Gorbachev visiting China in 1989 at that fateful time. And what qualitatively makes this potentially different? In other words, you've already noted that if you look at the numbers, there have been clear increases, but is there something different in terms of the strategic posture, the stance? Perhaps it's the relationship with China that's qualitatively different. What would you say makes this pivot perhaps more meaningful than in the past?
Well, we could say that the crisis with the West made the Russian government kind of more serious about investing more official efforts and also trying to look for new opportunities, economic opportunities in Asia. The other thing is the development of the Far East. There is a very important domestic part of this kind of international agenda here. Actually, the efforts of the government in early in 2000s, they proved to be really not efficient at all to develop the Far East, just like to pour more money into the Far East. So since early 2010, 2012, the government started to try to look for a new model of the development of the Far East and to try to make it more attractive for foreign investors. Thus, there has been kind of more desire, to put more emphasis on that. And we could see it again on the governmental attempts to host the Far Eastern Forum in Vladivostok in the Far East of Russia since 2016. It has been held every year, but just not the last year because of the pandemics, of course. And this year we have had a kind of a mixed format, both online, on campus, and also a lot of virtual participants. So we can see it clearly here, and also we can clearly see it again if we look at the share of Russia's energy exports, and if we look at the shares of Russia's trade and investment with Asian partners. I should say this is also the thing that we could have a look at. Of course, if we look at relations with China, we can clearly see that Russia's deteriorated relations with the West have played a role here.
Right.
But again, it has been kind of a long-term strategic course that China has been considered Russia's long-term strategic partner, with a lot of shared interests and gradually improving, gradually intensifying cooperation. However, I should say that, of course, Russia's crisis with the West and also the deterioration of US-China relations, they have kind of pushed the two together in much greater ways. And probably the current security cooperation, security developments that we have seen in the last couple of years clearly signalize that with this pressure, we can see more Russia focusing more and kind of working more on this. But I won't say that it's something that really intensifies as the pivot itself. I would say these are kind of changes within Russia's pivot to Asia.
Right.
And we can see probably different balance if we compare it to what used to be before the Crimean and Ukrainian crisis.
So in fact, let's dig in a little bit on the Russia-China alignment, because you talk about how, in some ways they have aligned interests, but also contradictory interests. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about that. What are sort of the key aligned interests? And you mentioned, of course, the US and the US presence in this part of the world. But also, where are they contradictory? Where might they not align so well?
That's, I think, great question. Both Russia and China consider themselves great powers, and I believe do behave accordingly. So I should say it's quite logical for great powers to have both areas of convergence of interests and both areas of divergence of interests, especially if they are not allies, but even if they are allies, we can clearly see that. So in terms of convergence, it's probably much more pronounced on the global level and the global scale. Also, of course, the joint quest for a multipolar world order or a polycentric world order, as probably Russian officials prefer to name it, is probably the major idea behind this partnership. And also we have more than 4,000 kilometers of border, and our history has really taught us that if we have negative security relations between Russia and China, it is a huge strain on our security. So having friendly relationship is very important for the security of both states. And again, it's quite logical if you can see that Russia has been kind of experiencing pressure from the West and China has been experiencing pressure from the Pacific. It is very logical in terms not to have full geopolitical encirclement for the two, to have stability on their border and to have good relations with each other. So I guess this is a very important underlying factor behind this alignment. And this is something that it's not connected with the West per se. So it's kind of the logic of bilateral relationship. Also, Russia and China have, of course, very different political and economic systems from each other, for sure, but they're still different from the West. And both Russia and China feel a lot of pressure from the West, and Russia increasingly in the last years, a lot of criticism of the political system, of the human rights agenda. So here, I guess, both countries, Russia and China, are quite comfortable partners for each other because we do not criticize each other's political systems or human rights issues. And in this way, we respect the different paths of development. So I guess this is also one of the underlying factors. Of course, there is this kind of pressure from the West, and there is this idea that the two should join efforts to promote, again, multipolar world order, to oppose unipolarity, or what both Russia and China see as US unilateral actions. So I guess these are major factors that have the alignment. Also, some common joint norms and perception, for example, about cybersecurity, and especially about the internet, for example, internet policy. There is some agreement between the two, and there is some disagreement with the West. So there are a number of areas here. And also Russia believes that global governance should be more inclusive. So it should include more non-Western powers, including China as well. And there should be some reforms. So I think here we can also see clearly a point of convergence. While Russia and China also frequently criticize American actions, American policy everywhere, but well, of course, also in Asia, especially the deployment of ballistic missile defense. This is a very important issue for Russia because Russia fears that the deployment of ballistic missile defense in different regional segments, actually, both in Europe, in the European side, and in Asian side. Yeah, they will kind of diminish Russia's own nuclear potential and the capability to launch a retaliatory strike. So, and this is something that for Russia is very important because the nuclear power has always been the major deterrence and the major source of deterrence. And also, this is one of the reasons why recently Russia has been developing new kind of weapons, like new tactical weapons, hypersonic weapons, as a kind of an answer to this deterioration of potential deterioration of its nuclear shield because of the American deployment of ballistic missile defense. So I guess also here the two are very clearly aligned, I mean, Russia and China. However, what I find in my research looking on Russia and China, that definitely Russia and China do have very different regional environment and very different regional conflicts. Of course, there are civilizational differences, which are very clear as well. But in terms of regional environment and regional conflicts, it is very clear that Russia and China do not want to be entangled into the conflicts of each other. So in terms of Snyder's dilemma, there is kind of a fear of entrapment. We don't want to be entrapped in the conflicts of each other. China would never like to really join Russia, for example, in Russia's conflict with the West and over Ukraine or other issues. And Russia also doesn't want to get entangled in the South China Sea, where Russia still holds neutral positions, in the East China Sea as well, of course, and just in different conflicts that China has with its neighbors in Asia. So I guess here there is a difference. Also, there is a difference if you look at the strategies of both states in Asia, and even maybe on a broader transregional space. On the one hand, we do see that Russia and China want to establish kind of a cooperative regional order in Eurasia generally, avoid competition as much as possible, and again, promote cooperation and stability as much as possible. But on the other hand, if we look at Asia specifically, and East Asia, Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, we can probably clearly see that China wants to realign the regional order, to transform the regional order in the way that would suit its interests best. And Russia would rather see the regional order polycentric again, as well as the global order. So for Russia, probably the ideal situation is when there are many centers of power. Some of them are more aligned, some of them are less aligned, but the order is kind of more or less flexible and rather cooperative, and it will give Russia some positions of a stakeholder.
Right.
But if the region is dominated by one power, I mean, be it the US or China, this will leave Russia much less strategic space, much less room for maneuver, and much less, well, kind of strategic independence. And this is something Russia would like to avoid, for sure. So here I can see there is again some difference of interest, and of course Russia has its own relationship with Asian states. India and Vietnam are, for example, are very important strategic partners of Russia. So Russia would really not like to sacrifice its relationship with both India and Vietnam, for example, for its relationship with China. So trying to also pursue some balance here.
Does this suggest then that when it comes to, say, Central Asia and the Eurasian concept or construct, as it were, and then if you think about the Belt and Road Initiative, that these may be areas of competition, or I wouldn't go so far as to say conflict, but at least a matter of difference of view, of perspective. How does Russia feel? How does Moscow feel about the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and indeed in China's own attempts to make inroads in Central Asia and that very important strategic region, in particular, given that Central Asia is really the part of a major part of that Silk Road concept that that Beijing has been promoting.
That's also, I think, a very interesting area. Here, Russia has its own concept of greater Eurasian partnership, something that has been put by Vladimir Putin in 2015, late 2015, and since then it has been developed as a kind of a broad, probably geopolitical and economic strategy of Russia in this huge space, and Russia regards Eurasia as really a huge, vast amount of land. What Russia would like to promote is the idea of integration of integrations, meaning that there are different initiatives, there are different organizations, and they should try to find how to cooperate rather than compete. Because clearly, as you have mentioned, of course, there is competition between Russia and China in this region, in both Central Asia and broader Eurasia. And of course, there is also potential for cooperation here as well. And there are joint interests such as economic development, stability, and of course, very important joint interests connected to Afghanistan and the current situation in Afghanistan, and not letting the region fall prey to terrorists, Islamic extremists, to continue to promote secular region, which is really very important, I think, for all Central Asian states and also for Russia and China here. So clear, there are some points of convergence here. And for Russia, it's also very important to be one of the centers of regional integration. So here, Russia's efforts are more focused on the Eurasian Economic Union, an economic union of 5 states, including Russia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Belarus, and Kyrgyzstan, which was also formed in 2015, and it has become one of the center of Russia's own integrative efforts in Eurasia. And specifically, there is a customs union. Of course, there is a free trade agreement within this Eurasian Economic Union, customs union, also economic and there are attempts to create a single economic space with some successes and some, of course, problems, but the customs union is already working. So here Russia has been trying, very importantly, to channel China's interests into this region, Central Asia and broader Eurasia, in order to promote the development of this region, but the development in the forms that will actually help all the regional economies or all the regional states to modernize and to develop comprehensively, not just to export resources and become more economically dependent on China, but to develop in a more sophisticated way, a more sustainable way. And for this idea, it's very important for Russia to try to find some cooperation with China's Belt and Road Initiative and the Eurasian Economic Union between the two. There have been some efforts put into that, but mostly as for now, we can see a lot of declarations that China supports the Eurasian Economic Union and Russia's Great Eurasian Partnership, and Russia supports officially also the Belt and Road Initiative. However, if we look into kind of what is happening on the ground, we will see that China's cooperation within the framework of the BRI is mostly on bilateral level, not the multilateral level. And this is something yet China has not really clearly tried to do together with Russia. Rather, China is doing it individually, just on country by country basis. And of course, this is a matter of concern to Russia. Again, if we look at economic resources, we can see clearly that China now has become a very important economic stakeholder and of course, the greatest economic partner of all the states in Central Asia. And here, Russia simply cannot match Chinese economic resources. This is impossible. However, Russia still has some kind of, some elements of its power and standing in the region connected with security, and also some joint, more sophisticated economic projects with the countries. And this is something, some advantages that Russia possesses that China does not have in the region. So I guess that Russia understands very well that the BRI is both an opportunity and a challenge. And again, there have been a lot of efforts recently put by both Russia and China, specifically to minimize the differences and to try to find some ways to cooperate. For example, for Russia, that's very important that the Chinese investment do not change the rules of the game in the region, that China does not really become a dominant player that that employs kind of asymmetrical economic dependence in order to gain some political benefits. So for Russia, it's very important that it doesn't happen. So it really has not being translated into something like that. So, again, that's why Russia has decided to specifically try to find some specific areas of cooperation. What we still cannot see is probably joint multilateral projects or some projects that will signify that Russia, China, and Central Asian states have been doing something jointly in the Belt and Road. Although, again, Russia officially has declared its support of the Belt and Road, we cannot see, for example, some large infrastructure projects even between, within this Belt and Road agenda in Russia. And still, this is something that has not really been tapped into, mostly because of the conditions. The conditions that have been put forward by China are not really something that Russia would like to agree to, and it's very difficult to negotiate some kind of new set of conditions. So just, I'm sorry for...
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, because I think in some ways what you're talking about is not just an issue for Moscow, but for many other countries. This kind of the holy grail is, can there be a tripartite or three-party projects in the BRI? And I don't think there are many, if any, really, that exist. But that's kind of what some countries had aspired to.
Yeah, and Russia for sure. So Russia would like to have some kind of joint multilateral projects, but for now we cannot see it. We do have one formal agreement between the Eurasian Economic Union and China on the economic partnership, but this is more like trade facilitation agreement. It does not really have a lot of impact. Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union, we are not ready for a full-fledged free trade agreement with China. Simply because it will undermine the industrial potential. So Russia has actually recently moved a little bit to Asia. Here, Russia has concluded, the Eurasian Economic Union has concluded FTA with Vietnam, for example, right. And there are some FTAs with other states which are being negotiated underway. Singapore, we have also concluded FTA with Singapore. So these are seen like small pilot projects. Probably FTA with ASEAN will be next. And then Russia might further look into more free trade agenda in the region, but probably in a decade or so. So it's not something that is immediate. And with China, it's too challenging for now.
This may be a little bit off piste, as it were, a question, but I think when it comes to, you mentioned China is such an economic power these days, particularly in its influence in Central Asia, that Russia may not be able to compete with that kind of power
economically. Yeah,
economically. But would you agree that that's true in some ways, like in other regions, like Africa, even in Southeast Asia, and where China has made a lot of inroads, Middle East, this is an issue that I would think that not just Russia, but certainly the United States and other countries are trying to deal with. What is the impact of that enormous Chinese power in terms of their influence and ability to influence the geopolitics in those regions?
Yeah, sure. This is something that is kind of a global issue, or maybe
it's a global issue,
region by region issue. I guess what we could objectively say is that Russia has not done enough to especially still I work more in East Asia and Asia Pacific, this kind of region. But for example, if you look at Southeast Asia, we can clearly see that Russia has not done enough. And in order to make its, again, pivot Asia more balanced, its relations with the regional states more balanced, and the economic relations with China, Japan, South Korea are much more developed than with ASEAN and India, for example. And here, for sure, Russia should have put much more efforts on doing that. Currently, we can see some new initiatives with Southeast Asian states in new spheres of, infrastructure, digital transformation, digital technologies, some other kind, medicine and others. But still, there's a kind of now small new steps, and we clearly here there is a lot of homework to be done.
And indeed, with say vaccine diplomacy, Russia wasn't really able to make as much headway using the vaccines to develop diplomatic relations as China has done, and even as the United States has done.
clearly we do have lack of industrial output simply.
Right.
I mean, just of the capacity to produce the vaccines on a large scale. And even I think although Sputnik V was the first vaccine to be produced, for some time we didn't have even enough vaccines in Russia itself. So
Right.
and negotiations just how to develop this production base, they took a lot of time. I think recently Russia has concluded some agreements with a number of states, including India and Latin American states and Asian states, just to use their production base. But this was something that really took time. Yeah, I guess here Russia could have done more, but this is more a kind of structural economic issue for Russia, the lack of our own production base.
Can I move to the strategic arena a bit? Because of course, with AUKUS now and the introduction of the idea, which won't be implemented for another 10, 15 years, of Australia having nuclear powered submarines. I saw some reports that Moscow didn't really react very well to this and reacted negatively to this development. Could we see then a move towards some kind of military alliance between Russia and China as a result of these developments? And you put that also into that context, the development of this Indo-Pacific construct, the elevation of the Quad into something more than the original humanitarian motives that created it. Do you see some development on the strategic side between Russia and China?
Let me first then answer on the part on the Indo-Pacific and Quad,
right,
and then move to China.
Right.
So on the Indo-Pacific thing, here Russia probably acts more as a very conservative power and a power that doesn't like the recent developments in the region. And I would say that because of Russia's really deteriorated relations with the West, and especially because of the heightened strategic competition with the US, almost everything that US has been doing is seen in a very negative light by Russia and by the Russian foreign policy officials. So clearly the Indo-Pacific dynamics, but especially the American Indo-Pacific strategy, has been very negatively viewed by Russia. And I would probably even say that Russia pays much less attention to the Indo-Pacific strategies of other states and mostly focuses on the US version. And if you ask why, we could see that in many ways still Russia's foreign policy remains to a large extent kind of Western-centric and maybe even US-centric. So Russia looks at US actions a lot, really a lot. Again, maybe this is because of the military power, of a huge comprehensive power by the United States. But this is clearly seen as a huge challenge and something that has been changing the regional order. And especially Russia is concerned that it could create two blocks and kind of competitive strategic space rather than cooperative. And here Russia, of course, would be compelled to join China, of course, not the other way around. And again, this is not something that Russia would like to do. Because if there is a joint alliance with China, I mean, a really full-fledged alliance, for now, maybe for a decade or two, it's kind of hard to judge, but for some time, it will be rather equal. And the Russian leadership believes that the relationship with China is still fairly equal because Russia has a much more sophisticated military potential and strategic potential, which has not been really matched by China. Even though, of course, the economic power, the GDP shows us a very different picture, of course. But on the military term, still Russia feels that it has much more sophisticated technologies. But in the long term, and again, of course, it depends on the Chinese economic development, on the Chinese military development, if it continues. But if it kind of if we suppose that it continues and China will get also very sophisticated military, for example, by 2050 or 2040, that will be, well, more or less on par with Russia, maybe not exactly, but more or less. And here we will have huge economic disparity as well. And again, currently we can see that Russia's economic relations with the West and especially with Europe have been kind of diminishing in terms of share, and its economic ties with China have been on the rise. And if, again, also kind of but if we have some more economic, for example, Russia's economic and technological dependence on China, if it emerges, we don't have it for now, but if Russia's relations with the West are still bad, and Russia's relations with China get even more intense, here we can, if Russia has this kind of alliance, Russia can find itself in a very uncomfortable position as of a junior partner. Again, it's not something that we will have for now, but it may emerge in future. And this is something, I guess, very important for the Russian leadership, because the Russian leadership believes in its strategic sovereignty. And the Russian strategic culture has been very focused on their strategic independence. So I guess this is not something that Russia would really like to do, to enter a full-fledged military alliance here with China, because, again, it will get Russia entangled in a lot of disputes Russia would not like to have. To find itself entangled into, and also it will diminish its space to maneuver. So if Russia sees that the American strategy to contain China, as Lavrov has described it, it is kind of creating these two competitive blocks. Of course, it sees these developments as kind of running counter to its own strategy. Also, again, for Russia as a major power, but economically weaker in Asia than other major powers, it's very important for Russia that there are some multilateral institutions, ASEAN-centric, basically, institutions, where Russia can have a say in regional matters, where Russia can be one of the stakeholders. But if Russia, and again, Russian foreign policy officials see the Quad as one of the major emerging groups that has been gaining more and more prominence and has been kind of undermining ASEAN centrality. Again, Russia believes that it runs counter to its interests in Asia. Also, I guess most states, I mean, like the US, don't really see Russia as an Indo-Pacific power. And this is very different from the Japanese and Indian perspective, because both Japanese and India see Russia as a Northern Pacific power, and also even the Indo-Pacific power. And if you look at what the Indians say, they maintain that India and Russia already have cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, because we already have cooperation in both the Pacific Oceans and Indian Oceans, that this is something out of reality. But again, in the perception of Russia's foreign policy elite, as the US has been promoting this Indo-Pacific strategy for Indo-Open Indo-Pacific, this is not something Russia can actually agree to. Again, Russia would never support something that that directly opposes China. I guess this has been one of the ideas behind Russia's diplomacy overall, that we do not support some alliances or coalitions that are directed against our strategic partners. For example, Russia does not support something like anti-Chinese groupings, and also, for example, doesn't support China regarding India. So again, Russia wants to have a kind of a balanced relationship here. And thus the Quad is seen as a kind of a negative development that runs counter to Russia's interests. But what I would say probably here is that it doesn't mean that Russia does not want to develop cooperation in the Indian Ocean with India and other states, or in the Pacific Ocean with the Asian Pacific states. Rather, Russia doesn't like this concept. And also, Lavrov has many times criticized the so-called rules-based order, because Russia finds that this is something that Russia has not really agreed to. It has not been the part of this order. So this is something that really impacts, and kind of nobody understands why it's not the international law like in the United Nations Charter, because Russia very frequently points to the United Nations Charter that everyone has agreed to. So, and moving to AUKUS, if
right.
back, so there has been a small statement by Lavrov during the UN session on the August. And what he basically said was that this way we can see that there are some disagreements even within the West, and we can clearly see that there are a lot of still unilateral policies by the United States going on, which really do not look at the interests of other allies, such as European allies. So here Lavrov probably found more space for Russia's cooperation with Europe if Europe becomes kind of more disillusioned about its relations with the United States. And also, if we look at different foreign policy speeches especially by Putin, I think we can clearly see that Russia would really like to kind of mend its relations with Europe. It's very difficult to resolve the current Ukrainian crisis, and presumably Russia is not ready really to compromise on its position, the current position, and not really change a lot. But we can clearly see that especially diminished links with Europe do have negative damage on well, Russia's development and of course on Russia's political and security relations with Europe. So here, even overall, Russia would like to get its foreign policy and economic times back again, kind of more balanced, right. Because the current push towards China, it has had, of course, it has brought some benefits to Russia. For example, Russia has diversified its energy exports, but on the same time, on the same page, Russia would not really like China's share to grow too much, and wouldn't like to, for example, have some kind of new technological dependence on China. Still, Europe is the main and remains the main source of technologies. But if the relationship is not mended, and if Russia has difficulties to acquire technologies from Europe, further, it might have no other options but to cooperate with China more and to become more economically and technologically dependent on China. And I think it's kind of quite logical that Russia does not want to have only one option. It wants to have broad options. So I think here it's a very difficult foreign policy dilemma for Russia, also what to do with the Indo-Pacific. And there are a lot of views in the Russian foreign policy community. I personally think that this Eurasian agenda and the Indo-Pacific agenda are not really opposite. We can find a lot of complementarities between them. Broadly speaking, Russian officials have sometimes said that the Indian concept and the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, they really are much more inclusive, and this is something that could be accepted by Russia if we look at some kind of Indo-Pacific cooperative engagement. But again, it's not the American strategy, and Russia avoids supporting the Indo-Pacific itself because of it. But generally speaking, the Indians and ASEAN strategies, I think, are quite compatible with Russia's strategy here. We don't want to choose between the sides. Right. The region to find some ways how to cooperate here.
It's really fascinating because I don't know, I hope our audience appreciates, because you're talking about so many different dimensions, which frankly these days, if you're trying to understand the region, you have to think about all these different kind of moving parts, as it were, and conceptualizing it. I think you're giving an insight into how difficult it is for, if you're sitting in Moscow or you're sitting in Beijing or even Ottawa or what have you, that countries to try to understand all the different aspects that you've discussed. It's a very, very complex situation now, and it's not just an Indo-Pacific issue. It truly, you have to think of globally about some of the different aspects. Maybe to sort of wrap up, I wanted to ask you about two small things or smaller things. You've talked a lot about the Russian relationship with India, and then you've already alluded to this, but if you see how India has moved, particularly after its clash last year with China, it's become more enthusiastic about the Quad. Do you foresee that as putting a strain on that long partnership between Russia and India? How do you see that? Has it put strains on that particular relationship?
Yeah, sure. And I should say the same is the case with Vietnam.
Right.
Here it does put a strain, and especially we can clearly see that India has been moving closer to the US and to cooperation with Quad. But I guess there has been a lot of understanding on the Russian side that we need to try to engage India more. On the one hand, and on the other hand, that we need to try to help India and China to bridge their differences, so that India does not really become, well, kind of a semi-ally or other kind of more robust security partner. With the US, which is the opposing power for us anyway. I guess we have seen also some discussions that Russia needs to maintain neutrality, and Russia also has tried to provide a platform, it was last year, for Indian and Chinese ministers to meet together to at least to de-escalate the dispute. Of course, maybe not to resolve the dispute, but to de-escalate the border dispute. And I guess that Russia has been concerned about these developments a lot, and there have been also joint efforts and discussions about what to do with Afghanistan, also kind of a broader regional agenda. But on the Indo-Pacific thing, Russia has also a very robust defense cooperation with India, and we also, for example, we have joint military production with India, something that we do not have with China. Here the level of trust has, as you have mentioned, been historically very deep. But of course, we do have a strain now, and I guess this is something that Russia still has a lot of work to do to work on. And one of the dimensions that really has been lagging behind has been economic partnership and economic cooperation. Again, if we compare trade, for example, Russia's trade with India is a little bit less than $10 billion, which is just a minimal sum of money. Of course, geography does play a role, but it doesn't account for everything. Right. And trade with China has been more than $100 billion. So there's a huge gap here. And before the pandemic, Narendra Modi visited Vladivostok and the Eastern Economic Forum in 2019. And one of the things that the two leaders, Putin and Modi, agreed on was a Vladivostok-Chennai trade corridor, the maritime one, to supplement also trade and to stimulate trade and investment. Of course, the pandemic has probably put everything on pause, but we have seen some new developments like new Indian investment in the Far East, which presently were almost non-existent in the Far East. Right. So this is something, there is kind of a consensus that this is something that needs to be done in order to counter these negative developments. But again, we need to see exactly what will be going on here.
Now, just sort of to finally wrap up on the strategic side, on Asia Pacific and the Pacific, you've mentioned the US version of FOIP, the Indian and ASEAN more inclusive versions. Japanese, of course, have been a prime mover of their own version of FOIP. But talk a bit about the possibility of resolving the territorial disputes between Russia and Japan, because of course that's really the most long-standing sort of issue that between the two countries?
Is there any prospect? Well, in the short term, it's not likely to happen, I would say, in the short to medium term. This is something I've also been trying to look into as much as I could in the last couple of years. We actually saw an unprecedented policy and economic moves by Abe administration, and there were a lot of cooperation on both sides going on, both in terms of economics, security, as well, and a lot of political dialogue. But for now, we can see that even that the Japanese side was ready to make some concessions, Russia presumably was not really ready to make huge compromises. For Japanese side, it's very unlikely to drop its claim to the islands. And for now, Russia seems not really prepared. The Russian government seems not prepared to give any islands to Japan. So there are a number of concerns here, and probably security and strategic concerns, I would say, have become really the key area here. And I would say that Russia's deteriorated relations with the US is the main factor to blame why there was no compromise reached. Again, because Abe was reportedly okay with only receiving the two smaller islands. However, security issues, and Russia has concerns that the US might put military bases or some military installations on these islands, and these islands could threaten the route of Russia's nuclear submarines, how they go out from the Okhotsk Sea, where there is Russian nuclear submarine base, to the broader Pacific, and thus threaten Russia's, again, nuclear potential, nuclear shield, and the possibility to launch a retaliatory strike. So there is kind of a broader strategic issue here. And now Russia seems to have consolidated its position, kind of hardened it. And I guess if we look at how much efforts Abe actually put into try to resolve this dispute, it's very unlikely that other Japanese prime ministers will do the same. But what we have, again, as kind of some positive result here is that Russia and Japan have resumed their security contacts. We do have still a kind of resumed security dialogue, which is very important in terms of confidence building and threat and kind of reducing the level of threat perception. This is very important for both states. And also there have been a lot of new economic projects. And again, this is something that has been considered beneficial by by the business of both states. So I guess it's not only like black. There have been some
positive things.
Yeah, on the positives.
And I'm wondering if you could tell us just briefly about what your research these days. What do you focus on nowadays? I mean, you've done a masterful tour d'horizon of Russian foreign policy in this region. What are you particularly focusing on these days?
I have been trying to cover Russia's policy in Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific. Actually, I have been working on Russia-Japan relations and looking into if Russia and Japan, maybe with India, ASEAN, and some other states, what can be our kind of regional broader framework for cooperation, and specifically what can we do together in the Indo-Pacific, even if Russia does not really support the Indo-Pacific or doesn't call the Indo-Pacific, but I mean practically in this region. So this is one of the areas I have been working on. The other is broader Russia strategy in Asia and in the Pacific. I mean, generally, and Russia's relationship with a number of states. And of course, Russia-China relations is something that is very important to look into. So at the same time, I'm trying to follow China's Belt and Road Initiative as much as I can well, especially the Maritime Silk Road, as this is the area I have been working on more. And also to look at Japan's foreign and economic policy in this region. So I'm trying to trying to follow different topics at the same time,
Yes.
to try to grasp the strategic picture, but probably I'm still working more on Russia's relations with this region, and hope to have some practical inputs here.
This is a really very rich portfolio and a very challenging portfolio of topics.
Right.
Lastly, I ask this of most of our guests these days. How have you fared during the pandemic? I assume one frustrating thing is the inability to travel to this part of the world to do your research. How have you fared, coped during the pandemic, you and your family?
Actually, especially if you are sitting in Moscow, really many hours away from the Asia-Pacific,
right.
It is something that you really start to miss, because of course you need to be in the region and you need to travel to different countries and to talk with people, not just online, because still online is good, but it does not really compensate for everything. So I guess this is something that we all miss in our area, and hope to that the contacts could be resumed someday, maybe next year. Generally speaking, Russia has had, quite a large number of infections. And as someone who has been working both in academia and teaching in the university, I can see two different sides of the picture here. On the one hand, of course, we all have been working more and more at home. I mean, this is something, and all these Zoom conferences, they, on the one hand, you have much more opportunities because you can join the conferences and Zoom talks by different countries actually, and you can participate. There is kind of more online participation here. But on the other hand, especially when dealing with many Asian states like Japan, the opportunities have actually diminished, I think. Again, online is not something that really has the same value as in-person discussions, especially maybe because there is lack of discussion.
Right.
Pure, genuine debates that you can actually have when you have in-person discussions. So it's kind of a double-edged sword here. You have some benefits and also you have some drawbacks. Another thing that I personally miss is that we started of course, when you mostly write from home, on the one hand, it's better because you have some more time to write. But on the other hand, you don't have this so much sense of academic community. And again, some academic discussions within your community is something that you really lack because they actually usually stimulate your thought a lot. In terms of teaching, we actually had a period when we taught online by using Zoom for several months. And it was both in spring term last year and in part of autumn term last year. And I guess the most challenging thing was how to actually take exams online and
right.
how to make sure that the students are not cheating, but at the same time, you have this some kind of check of their understanding and knowledge and the logic, and you actually can check something and grade them the same way as if it was kind of in-person teaching. Of course, it's not the same, and everybody understands that it's not the same. But I guess this is something that has been very, very challenging. And although we managed to quite well to connect online, but I still found that I think we teaching and studying by Zoom makes you cover kind of less topics and less material, so you start really to get behind the schedule.
Right.
It's not that also it's not that kind of interactive. So some students do participate. For others, I haven't heard almost anything for several months. I wasn't sure if they are alive or, if they are somewhere on the beach. I'm kidding because it's Russia, but still, yeah. And this is quite an issue. We have now resumed full online studies from this September. So hopefully, if we do not have a spike in COVID-19 cases, we will continue to teach online. Of course, we have some foreign students still by Zoom, so it's kind of a hybrid system, which is also very challenging. But anyway, in person, I think is something that we all miss. Probably a huge drawback of specifically teaching and now being in Russia is that many people really do not wear masks.
Right.
This is something that is probably unimaginable for you living and staying in Hong Kong or in
Right.
Asia, but here in Russia, many people really are not wearing masks. And when you come into the classroom where most students now are not wearing masks, you kind of become a little bit irritated with that, and you cannot actually make them do so. So I guess this is something that is quite a challenge nowadays for us who have resumed teaching.
Anna, this has been wonderful. You've been so generous with your time and so generous with your ideas and knowledge. We really appreciate that. I commend Anna's AsiaGlobal Online article to our listeners. Please go to the AsiaGlobal Online website to sign up for our newsletters. Go to the Asia Global Institute website and check out all the content. And follow us on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Anna, again, spasibo большое, and до свидания. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Alejandro. It was a great pleasure.